Girl with rare disease only responds to George Strait. What he did touched everyone. Sarah Sullivan watched her daughter Emily from the kitchen doorway, smiling as the 9-year-old's fingers danced across the piano keys. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the bay windows of their modest Nashville home, catching the auburn highlights in Emily's hair that looked just like her father's. "That sounds beautiful, sweetheart," Sarah said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Is that a new piece?" Emily nodded without looking up, her concentration unwavering. "Mrs. Henderson gave it to me yesterday. She says I'm learning faster than her other students." It didn't surprise Sarah one bit. Emily had always been exceptional, reading before kindergarten, solving complex math problems in her head, and developing a passionate curiosity about medicine that both amused and touched Sarah. The little girl's declaration at age 7 that she would become a doctor, just like Daddy, had brought tears to Sarah's eyes. 2 years after losing her husband Michael to a sudden heart attack at 38, the pain was still raw, but Emily's determination to follow in his footsteps gave Sarah a sense of peace she couldn't quite explain. 10 more minutes then. Homework, Sarah reminded her. Dr. Watson's daughter needs her daily dose of science. Emily grinned at the nickname her father had given her. Michael Sullivan had been Nashville's most beloved pediatrician, and his daughter seemed determined to inherit not only his career path, but his gentle bedside manner and insatiable curiosity. "Did you know the human brain has about 86 billion neurons?" Emily called out as Sarah returned to the kitchen. "I read it in Daddy's old medical book. That's more than all the stars in the Milky Way." Sarah laughed. "Well, yours must have a few billion extra, the way you remember things." The memory book lay open on the coffee table, another of Emily's projects. Since Michael's death, she'd been meticulously documenting family memories, pasting photos and writing detailed descriptions of events, some from when she was barely 3 years old. Her recall was remarkable, sometimes describing details of outings or conversations that even Sarah had forgotten. After dinner, their nightly ritual began as Sarah pulled out the old vinyl records. Michael Sullivan had been a devoted George Strait fan, his collection numbering over 30 albums. During her pregnancy, Sarah had placed headphones on her growing belly almost daily, playing the King of Country, because Michael insisted their child needed proper musical education from the start. "Amarillo by morning, or I Cross My Heart Tonight?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer. "Both!" Emily declared, settling onto the couch with her worn copy of Gray's Anatomy for Kids, a custom-illustrated version Michael had created for her 8th birthday, just months before his death. As the familiar opening notes of Amarillo by Morning filled their living room, Emily closed her eyes and swayed gently. "This one was playing when Daddy taught me to dance on his shoes," she whispered. "I was wearing my red dress with the white dots." Sarah nodded, marveling at her daughter's memory. Emily had been only 4 at the time, but she recalled every detail, right down to the thunderstorm that had forced them to cancel their planned zoo trip that day. "He'd be so proud of you," Sarah said softly, pulling Emily close as George Strait's smooth baritone wrapped around them like a comforting embrace. Later that night, after tucking Emily in, Sarah lingered in the doorway watching her daughter sleep. The moonlight cast gentle shadows across the room, illuminating the framed photo of Michael on the nightstand, him in his white doctor's coat, Emily perched on his shoulders, both laughing at some forgotten joke. Beside it sat a small trophy from last month's regional piano competition, where Emily had stunned judges with her rendition of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece typically considered too advanced for her age group. "We're doing okay, Michael," Sarah whispered to the darkness. "She's so much like you it hurts sometimes, but in the best possible way." Little did Sarah know that their world would begin unraveling in less than 48 hours. The first sign came during breakfast on Saturday morning. Emily stared at her plate of pancakes, cut into the shape of a stethoscope, as Sarah always did on weekends, with an odd expression. "What are these?" she asked, poking at them with her fork. Sarah laughed. "Very funny, Dr. Watson. They're your stethoscope pancakes. You want extra syrup today?" Emily looked up, confusion clouding her normally bright eyes. "Why do you call me that?" A chill ran down Sarah's spine, but she dismissed it quickly. Emily had stayed up late reading the night before. She was probably just tired. "Because you're my little doctor in training, silly, just like we've called you since you were 7. Emily shrugged and began eating silently, the momentary confusion apparently forgotten. But at her piano lesson that afternoon, Mrs. Henderson called Sarah with concern. "Emily seems distracted today," the older woman said quietly while Emily was in the bathroom. She couldn't remember the piece we've been working on for 3 weeks. When I asked if she'd practiced, she looked at me like she didn't understand the question. "She's probably just tired," Sarah assured her. "She was up late with her medical books again." Mrs. Henderson nodded uncertainly. "Of course, that must be it." But Sunday brought more unsettling moments. Emily couldn't find her bedroom, walking into the hall closet instead. At lunch, she asked who the man in the photos all around the house was, and when Sarah's mother called for their weekly chat, Emily showed no recognition of her grandmother's voice. "Mum, I think something's wrong with Emily," Sarah whispered, while her daughter sat uncharacteristically silent, staring at the television that wasn't even turned on. "Kids get summer bugs, dear," her mother reassured her. "Maybe it's one of those viral things that makes them foggy for a few days." Sarah scheduled an appointment with Dr. Rivera, who had taken over Michael's practice after his death. Monday morning found them in the familiar waiting room, surrounded by the colourful murals Michael had commissioned from local artists to make children feel comfortable. Emily looked around the office with wide eyes. "This is pretty," she said, as if seeing it for the first time, not the place she'd visited monthly throughout her life, or where she'd spent countless afternoons in her father's company. Dr. Rivera noticed the changes immediately. The normally chatty Emily, who typically peppered him with medical questions and proudly shared facts from her latest readings, sat quietly, answering only when directly addressed. "Emily, can you tell me the name of your school?" he asked gently. She hesitated. "The big one, with the playground?" Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched her purse. "She's attended Davidson Elementary since kindergarten. She's never forgotten anything in her life." After a thorough examination, Dr. Rivera's concerned expression deepened. "I'd like to run some tests, Sarah. Probably nothing serious, but given the memory issues and the confusion, I think we should do a neurological workup." The next 2 days passed in a blur of medical offices, blood draws, and imaging scans. Emily approached each procedure with a docility completely alien to her normally inquisitive nature. She didn't ask about the MRI machine's magnetic field, strength, or how the EEG measured brain activity, questions the old Emily would have eagerly posed. When Sarah showed her the memory book they'd been creating together, Emily flipped through it with polite interest, but no recognition. "These people look nice," she commented, pointing to a photo of herself with Sarah and Michael at the Grand Ole Opry for her 7th birthday. Thursday morning, Sarah's phone rang while Emily was still sleeping. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Dr. Abernathy from Neurology at Vanderbilt Children's. Dr. Rivera has referred Emily's case to me. I've reviewed her scans, and I'd like to see you both today if possible." 4 hours later, Sarah sat clutching Emily's hand as Dr. Abernathy explained the inexplicable. Emily's brain scans show patterns of neurodegeneration that we typically associate with elderly patients suffering from certain forms of dementia, the neurologist said gently. It's extraordinarily rare in children. There are fewer than 10 documented cases worldwide. Degeneration? Sarah repeated, the word feeling foreign in her mouth. You mean like Alzheimer's? Dr. Abernathy nodded grimly. The patterns are similar, yes. It's not genetic Alzheimer's, but a condition that mimics many of its symptoms. The medical literature calls it juvenile neurodegeneration with memory predominance, or JNMP. But that's impossible, Sarah whispered, watching Emily, who was contentedly coloring in a medical anatomy book, filling the detailed brain illustration with cheerful yellow crayon. She's 9 years old. I know this is shocking, Dr. Abernathy said. We'd like to admit Emily for observation and further testing. There are experimental treatments we can discuss, though I must be honest, the prognosis for the documented cases hasn't been encouraging. Sarah felt as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. Just a week ago, Emily had recited the entire periodic table from memory while they made dinner. Now her brilliant daughter couldn't remember which bedroom was hers, or recognize photos of her own father. How fast does it progress? Sarah managed to ask, her voice barely audible. Dr. Abernathy's hesitation told her everything before he even spoke. Variable. But in children this young, the neuroplasticity that usually helps brain healing can sometimes work against us, with the degeneration spreading more rapidly through developing neural pathways. Later that night, as nurses settled Emily into her hospital room, Sarah stepped into the hallway and finally allowed herself to break down. Sliding down against the wall, she buried her face in her hands and sobbed. For her brilliant daughter, who dreamed of becoming a doctor, for the memories already vanishing, and for Michael, who wasn't here to help her face this unimaginable nightmare. What do I do? She whispered to the empty corridor. Michael, what do I do? The silence offered no answers, and eventually, Sarah wiped her tears and returned to Emily's bedside. Her daughter looked up from her bed with a small, confused smile. Are you my nurse? Emily asked softly. Sarah felt her heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. No, sweetheart, she replied, her voice somehow steady, despite the searing pain in her chest. I'm your mum. Emily nodded politely, but her eyes held no recognition, only the vague acceptance of a child willing to believe what adults tell her. Sarah climbed onto the narrow hospital bed beside her, holding her daughter close as Emily drifted off to sleep, humming Amarillo by Morning through her tears and wondering if anything would ever bring her daughter back from the abyss that was swallowing her memories, one precious moment at a time. As moonlight filtered through the hospital blinds, casting striped shadows across Emily's peaceful sleeping face, Sarah made a silent vow. Whatever this cruel condition was, wherever it had come from, she would fight it with every ounce of strength she possessed. Somewhere inside this child was her brilliant Emily, the girl who memorized medical textbooks, who played Chopin with feeling beyond her years, who remembered every detail of her short life with her father. And somehow Sarah Sullivan was going to find a way to bring her back. The following weeks transformed Sarah Sullivan's life into an exhausting cycle of hospital corridors, medical consultations, and sleepless nights. Vanderbilt Children's Hospital became their second home as Emily underwent an endless battery of tests, blood work, spinal taps, advanced imaging, and genetic screenings that left both mother and daughter drained. A team of specialists gathered weekly to discuss Emily's case, their faces growing more somber with each meeting. The diagnosis of juvenile neurodegeneration with memory predominance was confirmed, but understanding the cause remained elusive. Each doctor offered theories: autoimmune dysfunction, unidentified viral infection, genetic anomaly, but none could explain why a perfectly healthy child had suddenly begun losing her memories at an alarming rate. It's spreading, Dr. Abernathy, explained during one particularly difficult consultation, pointing to the colorful brain scans on his computer monitor. The areas affected now include portions of her temporal lobe responsible for episodic memory and parts of her frontal cortex. Sarah stared at the images, trying to reconcile the beautiful, complex organ displayed on the screen with her daughter, who now sat in the hospital playroom, unable to remember how to tie her shoes. "What about the experimental treatment you mentioned?" Sarah asked, clutching her folder of notes. She'd become a reluctant expert in neurology over the past month, spending nights researching medical journals and case studies while Emily slept. Dr. Abernathy nodded. "We can start the immunomodulator therapy tomorrow. There's also a clinical trial at Johns Hopkins using a novel approach to protein clearance that might help, similar to treatments being developed for Alzheimer's. I've already spoken with the research team, and they've agreed to include Emily as a compassionate use case." Side effects? Sarah's voice was mechanical now, trained to ask the right questions even as her heart ached. "Significant," he admitted. "The immunosuppression will leave her vulnerable to infections. Fatigue, nausea, potential liver complications. The protein therapy is still experimental, with limited human data." "And if we do nothing?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "I'll sign whatever you need," Sarah said firmly. "We start tomorrow." That evening, Sarah wheeled Emily through the hospital garden, stopping near a small fountain where the setting sun cast everything in soft golden light. Emily had good days and bad days now. Today had been somewhere in between. She recognized Sarah as someone familiar, though she still couldn't quite place her as her mother. "Do you want to see some pictures?" Sarah asked, pulling out her phone. She had learned that regular exposure to family photos sometimes helped. Brief moments of recognition that the doctors called memory islands. Emily nodded, leaning against Sarah's shoulder as they scrolled through images of happier times. A Christmas morning with Emily unwrapping her first stethoscope. A father-daughter dance at the community center. Emily's piano recital just 3 months earlier. "That's me," Emily said, pointing to a photo of herself in a blue dress, seated at a grand piano. "I play music." Sarah's heart leaped. Yes, you do, sweetheart. You play beautifully." Emily studied the picture more closely, her brow furrowing with concentration. "The piano is big, black and white keys. I remember my fingers, knowing where to go." Sarah fought back tears. These moments of clarity were precious but increasingly rare. Yesterday, Emily hadn't even recognized her own reflection in the mirror. "Who's that man?" Emily asked, pointing to Michael's image in another photo. "That's your dad," Sarah explained, her voice catching. "He was a doctor who helped lots of children get better. He loved you very much." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "Where is he now?" "He died, sweetheart. His heart stopped working, but he loved you so much and he was so proud of you." Emily accepted this information with the odd detachment she now showed toward emotional subjects she couldn't connect with. Sarah had learned not to expect the grief or questions that would have come from the old Emily. Those emotions required context and memories that were now beyond her daughter's reach. "I'm tired," Emily said simply, and Sarah wheeled her back to her room. The experimental treatments began the next morning. Emily faced the infusions, injections, and monitoring with a stoicism that broke Sarah's heart, not because her daughter was brave, but because she couldn't remember to be afraid. Each new procedure was, to Emily's deteriorating mind, the first she'd ever experienced. 3 weeks into the aggressive treatment protocol, Sarah was dozing in the recliner beside Emily's hospital bed when a commotion woke her. Emily was thrashing in her bed, her body rigid with seizure. "Code Blue, room 412, a nurse shouted into the hall intercom as medical staff rushed in. The next hours passed in a terrifying blur. Emily was stabilized, but the seizure had been severe. An EEG showed alarming new patterns of electrical activity in her brain. "The treatment isn't working," Dr. Abernathy admitted the following morning. "In fact, I'm concerned it may have accelerated certain aspects of the neurodegeneration. We're seeing inflammation patterns we didn't anticipate." "So we stop the treatment," Sarah said, exhaustion evident in every syllable. "Yes, immediately. I'm so sorry, Sarah." Sarah had thought she was prepared for bad news, but the finality in the doctor's tone sent a chill through her bones. "What now?" Dr. Abernathy sat beside her, choosing his words carefully. "We focus on quality of life, make her comfortable, document her case thoroughly so it might help other children in the future, and—" He hesitated. "Prepare yourself for continued decline." "You're telling me to give up?" Sarah whispered. "I'm telling you that medicine has limits," he replied gently. "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is accept them." But acceptance wasn't in Sarah Sullivan's vocabulary, not when it came to her daughter, that night after Emily had fallen. Asleep, Sarah sat by the window overlooking the Nashville skyline, her mind racing through possibilities. There had to be something they hadn't tried, some approach they hadn't considered. She pulled out her laptop and once again dove into research, reading case studies of neurological anomalies and recovery against all odds. Around 3 in the morning, her eyes burning with fatigue, she stumbled upon an article about music therapy in dementia patients. The study described elderly Alzheimer's patients who couldn't recognize their own children but could sing along perfectly to songs from their youth. MRI scans showed that musical memories were stored differently than other memories, often preserved when other cognitive functions failed. Sarah stared at the screen, a wild hope blossoming in her chest. Emily had been exposed to music, specifically George Strait's music, since before birth. Michael had played those songs constantly during Sarah's pregnancy, convinced that his child would be born a country music fan. The next morning, Sarah approached Dr. Abernathy with renewed purpose. "I want to try music therapy," she announced without preamble. The neurologist looked up from Emily's chart with tired eyes. "We can certainly add that to her comfort care plan. The music therapist visits on Tuesdays and—" "No," Sarah interrupted. "Not just any music, specific music. George Strait." Dr. Abernathy's expression softened with sympathy. "Sarah, I know you're looking for solutions, but Michael played George Strait songs to my belly every day when I was pregnant," she pressed on. "Emily grew up with that music. It was our family soundtrack. What if those neural pathways formed early enough to be preserved?" To his credit, Dr. Abernathy didn't dismiss her outright. "The research on prenatal musical memory is limited, but there are some interesting studies on musical processing in developing brains." He sighed. "At this point, it certainly can't hurt to try. I'll make a note for the nursing staff." That afternoon, Sarah brought in their old record player from home and a stack of carefully selected George Strait albums. Emily watched with mild curiosity as Sarah set up the equipment. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the turntable. "It's how we listen to music," Sarah explained, selecting Straight from the Heart and gently placing the needle on the vinyl. As the opening notes of Amarillo by Morning filled the sterile hospital room, Sarah watched Emily's face intently, praying for a reaction. Any reaction that might indicate these musical memories remained intact while others had been stolen away. For nearly a minute, Emily showed no response, absently playing with the edge of her blanket. Sarah felt her fragile hope beginning to crumble. Then Emily looked up, her eyes widening slightly. "Cowboy song," she said softly. Sarah held her breath. "Yes, sweetheart, it's a cowboy song." Emily tilted her head, listening more intently, as George Strait's smooth baritone continued the familiar chorus. Her fingers began to tap lightly against the blanket, not quite in rhythm, but clearly responding to the music. "I know this," she said, with more certainty than she'd expressed. "About anything in weeks." Sarah nodded encouragingly, afraid to speak and break whatever tenuous connection was forming. "The man sings about horses," Emily continued haltingly, "and mourning." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. These weren't just vague impressions. Emily was recalling specific lyrics. The temporal lobe damage hadn't erased everything after all. When the song ended, Sarah quickly selected another track, "The Chair," another Sullivan family favorite that Michael used to dance to with Emily standing on his boots. As the gentle melody began, something extraordinary happened. Emily smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, not the vacant expression she'd worn for weeks. "Daddy's song," she said clearly. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a sob. Yes, it's Daddy's song. Do you remember dancing with him?" Emily's brow furrowed with concentration, but instead of the frustrated confusion such questions usually provoked, she seemed to be actively searching her memories. "Tall boots," she said finally, "standing on them, moving slow." Sarah couldn't contain her tears any longer. She nodded vigorously, unable to speak. Emily had just recalled a specific memory, one that had seemed permanently lost to the degenerative disease ravaging her brain. Over the next several days, Sarah created a careful routine of musical exposure. The hospital staff, initially skeptical, became cautiously optimistic as they observed Emily's responses. During George Strait songs, she was more alert, more verbal, and occasionally offered unprompted memories. Dr. Abernathy brought in a colleague specializing in music cognition, who watched in amazement as Emily, who couldn't remember what she'd had for breakfast, sang along to the chorus of "I Cross My Heart." The neural pathways for music processing involve multiple regions of the brain, the specialist explained. It's possible that the emotional significance of these particular songs, combined with their deep embedding from early development, created redundant pathways that have survived the neurodegeneration. "So the music is helping her remember?" Sarah asked hopefully. The specialist tempered her response. "Not exactly healing or reversing the condition, no. But it seems to be activating preserved memory islands and potentially forming bridges between damaged neural networks. It's fascinating from a research perspective and genuinely encouraging for Emily's quality of life." Quality of life. The phrase echoed in Sarah's mind. It wasn't a cure. Emily still faced a progressive, devastating condition, but these moments of connection, of her daughter truly being present, felt like miracles after weeks of watching her slip away. Word of Emily's unusual response to George Strait's music spread through the hospital. Nurses began timing their difficult procedures to coincide with Emily's favorite songs, when she was most cooperative and communicative. Physical therapists noted improved coordination during musical sessions. Even Emily's appetite improved when meals were accompanied by the familiar country tunes. Sarah documented everything meticulously, recording videos of Emily's responses and keeping detailed notes on which songs elicited the strongest reactions. She began to identify patterns, songs from the early 90s that Michael had played, most often during her pregnancy, seemed particularly effective. Amarillo by Morning, The Chair, and I Cross My Heart topped the list of what Sarah now called memory activators. 6 weeks after beginning the music therapy, Emily experienced what the medical team considered a significant breakthrough. During I Cross My Heart, she suddenly looked at Sarah with unusual clarity and asked, "Is Daddy in heaven?" Sarah, startled by both the question and the coherence behind it, nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, he is." Emily considered this, then said, "I remember. He got sick. His heart. You cried for a long time." The memory was accurate, a complex recollection that encompassed both factual and emotional components that Emily's doctors had believed were permanently lost. Sarah immediately recorded the interaction in her notebook, then texted Dr. Abernathy, who came to the room within minutes. "Emily," he said gently, "can you tell me who this is?" He gestured to Sarah. Emily looked at Sarah for a long moment, her eyes focused in a way they rarely were anymore. "She's my mom," she said simply. Then, with a flash of her old smile, she added, "Her name is Sarah Sullivan, and she makes pancakes shaped like doctor things." Dr. Abernathy couldn't hide his astonishment. Just yesterday, Emily had failed to recognize Sarah during his morning rounds, addressing her as the nice lady. "This is remarkable," he murmured, making notes in Emily's chart. "It suggests the memories aren't completely erased, just inaccessible without the right stimulus." For the first time since Emily's diagnosis, Sarah allowed herself to feel genuine hope, not for a cure. She understood the reality of the degenerative process too well now, but for moments like these, windows of connection with her daughter that she had feared were closed forever. That night, a local news station ran a human interest piece about Emily, interviewing Dr. Abernathy about the unusual case of a young girl whose fading memories seemed temporarily restored by country music. The segment included footage of Emily responding to "Amarillo by Morning," her face lighting up with recognition as the familiar melody played. Sarah hadn't sought publicity, but she didn't object when the hospital's public relations team suggested the story. If Emily's case could advance research or help another child, the exposure would be worthwhile. What Sarah couldn't have anticipated was how quickly the story would spread. By morning, the video clip had gone viral, picked up by national news outlets, and shared thousands of times on social media. Emily Memory Songs was trending, and Sarah's hospital room email account was flooded with messages from well-wishers, other families affected by neurological conditions, and music therapists offering services. And somewhere in Texas, on a sprawling ranch far from the media frenzy, a legendary country music star watched the news story on his iPad with growing emotion, recognizing an extraordinary opportunity to make a difference in a young girl's life, a difference that no medical treatment had been able to achieve. George Strait sat at his kitchen table, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows of his Texas ranch house, illuminating the steam rising from his coffee cup. At 72, the king of country had settled into a comfortable routine that balanced his continued music career with the quiet pleasures of ranch life. The weathered lines on his face told stories of decades on stage, while the strength in his hands spoke of mornings spent working his land, a duality he'd maintained throughout his legendary career. "George, have you seen this?" His wife, Norma, asked, setting her iPad in front of him. They'd been married for 52 years, and she still approached each morning with the vitality that had first attracted him when they were high school sweethearts. He adjusted his reading glasses and peered at the screen. A news article headline read, "Nashville Girl's Degenerative Brain Condition Responds Only to George Strait Songs." "What in the world?" he murmured, tapping the video embedded in the article. The footage showed a small hospital room where a frail girl with auburn hair sat propped against pillows, her expression vacant until music began playing, his voice singing "Amarillo by Morning." The change was immediate and striking. Her eyes focused, her posture straightened, and a glimmer of recognition transformed her face. "Extraordinary," the neurologist in the video was saying. "Emily's condition has severely impaired her memory function, but something about George Strait's music creates neural connections that temporarily bridge the damaged pathways." The camera panned to a tired-looking woman holding the child's hand. "These songs have been part of her life since before she was born," the mother explained, her voice thick with emotion. "Her father played them constantly during my pregnancy and throughout Emily's childhood. Now, they're the only thing that brings her back to us." George set down his coffee, suddenly finding it difficult to swallow. "There's more," Norma said gently, scrolling down to show him additional footage. In this clip, the little girl was singing along to "I Cross My Heart," her voice thin, but the lyrics perfect. When the song ended, she looked at the camera with brief clarity and said, "Daddy loved George Strait. He said his songs tell true stories about life and love." George removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture Norma recognized from 45 years of performing. It was what he did when emotion threatened to overwhelm him. "Her father passed away 2 years ago," Norma explained, softly. "According to the article, he was a pediatrician, played your music in his exam rooms to calm nervous children." George nodded slowly, absorbing this information. Throughout his long career, he'd received countless letters from fans sharing how his music had affected their lives, providing the soundtrack for first dances, comforting them through deployments overseas, or giving them strength during difficult times. But this was different. This wasn't just emotional comfort, it was a medical phenomenon. "Where is she?" he asked finally. "Vanderbilt Children's Hospital in Nashville. The article says her condition is progressive. The doctors don't expect—" Norma paused, her voice catching. "They don't expect her to retain any functional memory within a few months." George stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the rolling Texas landscape he loved. For several minutes, he was silent, deep in thought. When he turned back, his expression had shifted from contemplation to determination. "Call Tom," he said, referring to his longtime manager. "Tell him we need to reschedule the studio sessions next week and see if the jet can be ready tomorrow morning." Norma smiled, already reaching for her phone. "I'll pack our bags." Sarah Sullivan was exhausted. The media attention following Emily's story had been overwhelming, equal parts blessing and burden. On one hand, neurologists and researchers from around the country had reached out, offering consultations and experimental protocols. On the other, managing the flood of interview requests and well-meaning visitors consumed energy she desperately needed for Emily's care. "Just one more," the hospital's PR director pleaded, standing in the doorway of Emily's room. "Good Morning America is sending a crew this afternoon. The national exposure could help connect you with specialists who might otherwise never hear about Emily's case." Sarah sighed, looking at her daughter, who was currently experiencing one of her cloudy periods, staring blankly at the wall, disconnected from her surroundings despite the George Strait album playing softly in the background. These episodes were becoming more frequent, the windows of lucidity narrowing despite the musical intervention. "Fine," Sarah conceded, "but only if Emily's having a good moment. I won't parade her on national television if she's not present. Enough to understand what's happening." The PR director nodded gratefully. "Of course, and there's something else. We've been flooded with fan mail and gifts. The security office has procedures for screening everything, but I thought you might want to see some of the letters." She handed Sarah a bundle secured with a rubber band. These seemed especially meaningful. After the director left, Sarah flipped through the envelopes, notes of encouragement from parents of children with various neurological conditions, cards from George Strait fans sharing how his music had helped them through difficult times, and drawings from children in hospital wards across the country. The last envelope was thicker than the others, bearing a Texas return address. Inside was a handwritten letter on simple stationery. "Dear Ms. Sullivan and Emily, I've been making music for over 40 years, but I've never been more touched than when I saw the video of your brave daughter responding to my songs. Music has always been powerful, but seeing it serve as a bridge to Emily's memories reminds me why I started singing in the first place, to connect with people's hearts. If my songs bring Emily even a moment of peace or help her find her way back to cherished memories, that means more to me than all the gold records on my wall. I'd like to help if I can, My wife Norma and I will be in Nashville later this week. With your permission, we'd like to visit Emily. No cameras, no publicity, just a private visit from one George Strait fan to another. With respect and hope, George Strait. Sarah read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling. George Strait, the actual George Strait, had written personally and wanted to visit Emily. It seemed impossible, surreal. "What's that, Mommy?" Emily asked, startling Sarah. She'd been so absorbed in the letter, she hadn't noticed her daughter's sudden shift to alertness. One of George's earliest hits, "You Look So Good in Love," was playing now, apparently having triggered a moment of clarity. "It's a letter," Sarah explained, quickly wiping away tears, "from George Strait, the man who sings these songs." Emily's eyes widened with genuine interest, an expression Sarah had feared she might never see again. "The cowboy singer? He wrote to me?" "Yes, sweetheart. He saw a video of you listening to his music and he wants to come visit you." Emily considered this with surprising thoughtfulness. "Will he bring his guitar?" The question, so specific, so connected to reality, made Sarah laugh through her tears. "I don't know, but we can ask him." For the remainder of the afternoon, Emily experienced what Dr. Abernathy called her best day in weeks, asking coherent questions, recognizing several nurses by name, and even recalling that her favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear named Dr. Fuzzy, had been a gift from her father on her 5th birthday. When Dr. Abernathy came for his evening rounds, Sarah showed him the letter. "This is extraordinary," he said, reading George Strait's words. "And the timing couldn't be better. We've been collecting data on Emily's neurological responses to recorded music, but having the actual artist present would allow us to measure whether live performance creates a stronger effect." "This isn't about research," Sarah said firmly. "This is about Emily having a special experience while she still can." Dr. Abernathy nodded apologetically. "Of course. I didn't mean to sound clinical. I'm just excited about anything that might help Emily and potentially other children with similar conditions in the future." Sarah softened. "I understand. And yes, if George Strait's visit provides any medical insights, I'm all for documenting them. But first and foremost, this is for Emily." After consulting with hospital security and administration, arrangements were made for a private visit the following Sunday. Despite efforts to keep the plan confidential, rumors began circulating among hospital staff. By Saturday evening, several nurses had volunteered for Sunday shifts, and the hospital gift shop had sold out of George Strait CDs. Sarah spent Saturday night helping Emily understand what would happen, carefully managing expectations while honoring her daughter's excitement. "Will I remember meeting him?" Emily asked with heartbreaking self-awareness as Sarah tucked her in. Sarah stroked her hair gently. "I'll take pictures, sweetheart. Lots of them. And we'll watch videos together. So even on days when memories are hard to find, you'll know it really happened." Emily nodded, her face serious. "Sometimes I know things are missing. It's like trying to catch bubbles underwater. I can see shapes, but when I reach for them, they float away." The poetic description stunned Sarah. It was the most articulate Emily had been about her condition, showing a level of metacognition the doctors had believed was beyond her capabilities now. "That must be scary," Sarah whispered. "Not when the music plays," Emily replied, her eyelids growing heavy. "The bubbles stay still then. I can almost touch them." Sunday morning arrived with a flurry of activity. Though hospital administration had agreed to maintain privacy regarding the visit, extra security personnel were stationed discreetly throughout the pediatric wing. Emily's room had been moved to a larger private suite at the end of a corridor that could be easily secured, and Dr. Abernathy had arranged for minimal monitoring equipment that wouldn't intrude on the visit, but would record Emily's neurological responses. By mid-morning, Emily was showing signs of anxiety, the disruption to her routine triggering confusion. "Where are we?" she asked repeatedly, each time forgetting Sarah's answer within minutes. Dr. Abernathy suggested a mild sedative, but Sarah refused. "The music will calm her," she insisted, selecting Easy Come, Easy Go from their playlist, a mellower track that had consistently soothed Emily during previous agitated episodes. Sure enough, within minutes of the song starting, Emily's breathing slowed and her questions ceased. By 11 o'clock, she was calmly coloring in a book of horse illustrations that a nurse had brought her, occasionally humming along to the George Strait compilation playing in the background. At precisely noon, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text. From the hospital's public relations director, "They're here, coming up the service elevator now." Sarah's heart began racing. She quickly checked Emily's appearance. The new dress they'd picked out together during a clear moment earlier in the week, her hair brushed and tied back with a ribbon, the hospital room decorated with drawings Emily had created during art. "In therapy." "Emily," she said gently, "remember our special visitor today. He'll be here any minute." Emily looked up from her coloring book, her expression frustratingly blank. "George Strait," Sarah prompted, "the cowboy singer. We talked about it this morning." No recognition flickered in Emily's eyes. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. After all the arrangements, all the excitement, Emily was having one of her absent moments now, when it mattered most. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and went to answer it. Standing in the hallway was George Strait himself, not in the elaborate stage attire of his concerts, but dressed simply in jeans, a button-up shirt, and his signature cowboy hat. Beside him stood his wife Norma, carrying a small guitar case, and a man Sarah assumed was part of his management team. "Ms. Sullivan?" George said warmly, extending his hand. "I'm George Strait. Thank you for letting us visit your daughter." His voice, that unmistakable voice that had been playing in their home for years, the voice that now served as a lifeline to Emily's fading memories, was exactly as it sounded on the records, perhaps a bit deeper with age, but still smooth as Tennessee whiskey. "Thank you for coming," Sarah managed, suddenly overwhelmed by the surreality of the moment. "Please call me Sarah, and Emily is—" She glanced back at her daughter, still absorbed in her coloring. "Emily's having one of her difficult moments right now. I'm so sorry." George nodded understandingly. "Don't you worry about that. We're in no hurry." Norma stepped forward with a warm smile. "We brought something that might help," she said, gesturing to the guitar case her husband now took from her. Sarah invited them in, making quick introductions to Dr. Abernathy and the nurse on duty, both trying admirably to maintain professional composure despite their obvious awe at the country legend's presence. George approached Emily slowly, pulling a chair to sit near but not too near her bed. "Hello there, Emily," he said gently. "I hear you're a fan of my music." Emily looked up, studying his face with the detached curiosity she now showed. Toward most new people, no spark of recognition, no excitement, just polite attention. "My name's George," he continued, his voice as calm and steady as if he were gentling a nervous horse. "I thought maybe I could play you a song or two. Would that be okay?" Emily nodded, her gaze drifting to the guitar case he was opening. George removed the instrument. Not a fancy stage guitar, Sarah noticed, but a well-worn acoustic that showed signs of regular use. He positioned it comfortably, his movements fluid with decades of practice, and strummed a few chords to check the tuning. "Now, what should we play first?" he mused, looking to Sarah for guidance. "Amarillo by Morning," she suggested immediately. "It's the one that seems to reach her most consistently." George nodded and began to play, his fingers finding the familiar introduction without conscious thought. When he began to sing, His voice filled the small hospital room with a warmth and richness no recording could fully capture. All eyes were on Emily, whose coloring pencil had gone still in her hand. For several measures, she showed no reaction beyond a slight tilt of her head, listening. Then, as George reached the chorus, something extraordinary happened. Emily looked up, directly at him, her eyes suddenly clear and focused. "You're George." "Strait," she said with absolute certainty. The music didn't falter, but George's eyes crinkled with emotion as he nodded and continued singing. Emily set aside her coloring book entirely and shifted to the edge of her bed, watching him with complete attention. When he finished the song, the room held its collective breath. Emily's face had transformed, the vacant expression replaced by animation and recognition. "That's my favorite," she said confidently. "Daddy used to dance with me when it played. He said it's about never giving up, even when life gets hard." Sarah covered her mouth to stifle a sob. Michael had indeed told Emily that. Years ago, during a conversation Sarah herself had almost forgotten. George cleared his throat visibly, moved. "Your daddy sounds like a wise man." "He was a doctor," Emily continued, her words flowing with unusual ease. "He helped kids feel better. Now he's in heaven, but he still listens when you sing." The simple statement, delivered with a child's certainty, brought tears to everyone's eyes, including George's, though he blinked them away quickly. "Well, then," he said, adjusting his guitar, "we better give him a good show. What else should we play for him?" For the next hour, something miraculous unfolded in room 412 of Vanderbilt Children's Hospital. As George Strait moved through his catalogue of hits, The Chair, I Cross My Heart, Check Yes or No, Emily became increasingly present and engaged. She sang along to choruses, shared memories triggered by specific lyrics, and even corrected George when he playfully mixed up words to test her recall. Dr. Abernathy observed quietly from the corner, occasionally making notes on his tablet, but primarily watching in undisguised amazement as Emily displayed levels of cognitive function that had been absent for weeks. During I Cross My Heart, Emily suddenly turned to Sarah. "Mum, remember when Dad proposed to you again on your anniversary? He sang this song in the backyard and gave you that ring with the blue stone." Sarah gasped. The memory was from Emily's 6th birthday, their 10th anniversary, when Michael had surprised her with a sapphire ring and a reaffirmation of their vows. They had never discussed that private moment with Emily. She had simply witnessed it, from the kitchen window while waiting for her birthday cake. "You remember that?" Sarah whispered. Emily nodded confidently. He was nervous. His hands were shaking, but he said the words "perfect," just like in your wedding video. George and Norma exchanged glances, clearly moved by this intimate family moment they were privileged to witness. "Music is powerful medicine," George said softly, strumming gentle chords as background to the conversation. "My grandfather had Alzheimer's. Couldn't remember my name most days, but put on a Bob Wills record, and he'd tell you stories from dance halls 70 years past." As the afternoon continued, Emily's energy remained remarkably stable. She asked George questions about his horses, his ranch, and how he learned to play guitar. She showed him her drawings and medical books, explaining with startling coherence her dream of becoming a doctor like her father. For those precious hours, Emily Sullivan returned, not just in fleeting glimpses, but fully present, her personality and memories intact in a way Sarah hadn't witnessed since the early days of her illness. When it was finally time for the Straits to leave, Emily's eyes showed the first signs of fatigue, but her awareness remained clear. "Will you come back?" she asked as George packed away his guitar. "I'd like that very much," he replied, genuine affection in his voice. "Maybe next time I'm in Nashville for a show." Emily considered this, then asked with disarming directness, "What if I don't remember you came today?" The room grew quiet. It was the question everyone had been avoiding, the cruel reality of her condition that no amount of celebrity magic could permanently change. George thought carefully before answering. "Well," he said finally, "then I'll just have to remind you. Music has a way of finding memories even when they're hiding real good." He reached into his pocket and removed his black cowboy hat pin, a small silver emblem he'd worn on stage for decades. "This is for you," he said, placing it in her palm. "So even on days when memories are hard to catch, you'll have proof we spent this afternoon together." Emily closed her fingers around the pin, a smile of genuine delight lighting her face. "Thank you for making the bubbles stay still," she said cryptically. George looked questioningly at Sarah, who mouthed, "I'll explain later." As the Straits prepared to leave, George pulled Sarah aside, while Norma continued chatting with Emily. "I don't pretend to understand what's happening medically," he said in a low voice, "but I've never seen anything like this in all my years of performing. If my music helps that little girl find her way back, even for short times—" He paused, emotion making his voice rougher than usual. "I want you to know you can call on me any time." Sarah fought back tears. "Thank you doesn't begin to cover it. Today was. You gave us both a gift beyond measure." George nodded, uncomfortable with praise, as most legends are. "There's something about her, a special light. Reminds me of my grandson who passed some years back. That same old soul in young eyes." After the Straits departed, Emily remained remarkably present for several more hours, recounting details of the visit with perfect clarity and admiring her new pin. Dr. Abernathy conducted a brief cognitive assessment, documenting her dramatic improvement compared to that morning's baseline. "It's unprecedented," he told Sarah quietly, as Emily finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the emotional and mental exertion. The live music created a more profound response than recordings ever have. And the personal connection, the engagement, it activated neural pathways we thought were permanently compromised. "What does it mean?" Sarah asked, hope warring with caution in her voice. "I don't want to create false expectations," he replied carefully. "The fundamental degeneration hasn't been reversed. But today suggests there might be ways to access what remains more effectively than we thought possible. With your permission, I'd like to consult with some colleagues about designing a more structured music therapy program based on what we observed." Sarah nodded, watching her sleeping daughter, peaceful with George Strait's pin clutched in her hand. Later that night, as Sarah checked her phone, she discovered something unexpected, an email from George Strait's manager with a large audio file attached. The message was brief. George recorded these acoustic versions of his songs specially for Emily last night in our hotel room. He thought they might help on difficult days. Sarah pressed play on the first track, and George's voice filled the room, more intimate than his polished albums, as if he were sitting beside Emily's bed. "This is for you, Miss Emily Sullivan. Your dad had good taste in music, and you have a warrior's spirit. Here's Amarillo by Morning to help those memory bubbles stay still." In her sleep, Emily smiled. The next morning, when the story of George Strait's visit inevitably leaked to the media, despite everyone's best efforts at discretion, the headlines weren't about a celebrity's charity work or a photo opportunity with a sick child. They were about something far more profound, how the king of country music had walked into a hospital room and, for a few hours, helped a little girl find her way back from the darkness that was slowly claiming her mind. And in recording studios and research laboratories across the country, people began asking new questions about music, memory, and the mysterious ways they intertwine. Questions that would soon open doors no one had thought to look for. Act 4. The confrontation. The media storm that followed George Strait's hospital visit was both blessing and curse for the Sullivans. National news outlets picked up the story, with headlines ranging from the factual "Country Legends Music Triggers, Memories in Girl with Rare Condition" to the sensationalized "Miracle on Music Row, George Strait Cures Child's Brain Disease." The latter particularly infuriated Sarah, who had to repeatedly explain to well-meaning relatives that Emily's condition remained progressive and incurable despite the remarkable but temporary improvements during George's visit. Dr. Abernathy helped shield them from the worst of the media attention while leveraging the publicity to advance research into Emily's condition. Within days of the story breaking, the hospital received funding offers from 3 neurological research foundations and a pharmaceutical company interested in studying music-activated neural pathways. "It's a double-edged sword," Sarah confessed to Norma Strait during one of their now regular phone calls. The two women had formed an unexpected bond, with Norma serving as both emotional support and protective gatekeeper. "The attention brings resources we desperately need, but Emily gets overwhelmed by all the strange faces and disruptions to her routine." "George worries about that too," Norma replied. "He's been turning down interview requests left and right. Says this isn't about publicity, it's about Emily." 2 weeks after the visit, Emily's neurological tests showed a paradoxical development. While her overall condition continued to deteriorate, with increasing episodes of confusion and memory loss, her responses to George Strait's music remained remarkably strong. The custom recordings he'd made especially for her proved particularly effective, often bringing her back from severe dissociative episodes when nothing else could reach her. Dr. Abernathy and his expanding research team developed theories about the phenomenon. "We believe the emotional connection formed during George's visit strengthened the neural pathways associated with his music," he explained during a consultation with Sarah. "Emily's brain has essentially created a protected channel, like a dedicated emergency frequency that remains accessible when regular communications are down." The hospital established a formal music therapy program based on Emily's case, with Emily as the first participant. A dedicated music therapist worked with her daily, using George's recordings as anchors to attach new information and experiences that might otherwise be lost to her deteriorating memory. Sarah documented everything in what she now called the memory journal, noting which songs triggered which memories and how long the periods of clarity lasted. The patterns were fascinating but heartbreaking. Emily's lucidity was becoming more episodic, the windows of clarity briefer, though no less intense during the moments they appeared. One evening in late September, as Sarah was helping Emily prepare for bed, her daughter suddenly looked up with an expression of perfect clarity. "When is George coming back?" she asked. Sarah paused. It had been a particularly difficult day. Emily had forgotten how to use silverware at lunch and had spent the afternoon unable to recognize the hospital room she'd lived in for months. "I'm not sure, sweetheart. He's very busy with his music." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "I need to show him something. I made it for him." She pointed to a drawer in her bedside table. Curious, Sarah opened it to find a carefully folded piece of paper she didn't recognize. Inside was a drawing Emily must have created during one of her art therapy sessions, a surprisingly detailed sketch of George playing guitar in her hospital room, with musical notes floating around him like tiny stars. Below the drawing, in Emily's increasingly unsteady handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for finding me when I was lost." Sarah fought back tears. "It's beautiful, Em. We'll make sure he gets it." "No," Emily said with unexpected firmness. "I need to give it to him myself before I forget how to draw." The simple statement, delivered with such self-awareness, pierced Sarah's heart. Emily understood what was happening to her, at least during her moments of clarity, and the knowledge clearly brought her pain. "I'll see what we can do," Sarah promised, already composing a text to Norma in her mind. 3 days later, Sarah received an unexpected call from George's manager, Tom. "George is scheduled for a charity performance at the Ryman next month," he explained. "It's a small acoustic show, very low-key. He'd like to invite Emily as his special guest, if her doctors approve." Sarah immediately consulted with Dr. Abernathy, who was cautiously supportive. "Her physical condition is stable, and the emotional benefits could outweigh the stress of the outing," he noted. "But we'll need contingency plans in case she becomes disoriented in the unfamiliar environment." Plans were made with meticulous attention to detail. The Ryman Auditorium, historic home of the Grand Ole Opry and sacred ground in country music, arranged for a private entrance and a specially designed sound-controlled box where Emily could watch without being overwhelmed. George agreed to perform specific songs from their established memory activation playlist, and medical staff would remain on standby throughout the evening. As the date approached, Sarah worried constantly about whether Emily would be having a good day when the concert arrived. The little girl's cognitive function had become increasingly unpredictable. Some mornings, she woke perfectly lucid, reciting facts from her medical books and discussing her treatment with sophisticated understanding. Other days, she stared blankly at Sarah, asking repeatedly who the nice lady was. The day of the concert, Sarah entered Emily's hospital room with a mix of hope and trepidation. Emily was sitting up in bed, listening to one of George's custom recordings through headphones, her eyes closed. "Good morning, sunshine," Sarah said brightly. "Big day today." Emily opened her eyes and removed the headphones. "Concert day," she said clearly. "George is singing at the Ryman, and we have special seats." Relief flooded through Sarah. "That's right. How are you feeling about it?" "Excited. Nervous." Emily's brow furrowed. "Scared I might get lost in my head while we're there." The phrase "lost in my head" had become their gentle euphemism for Emily's dissociative episodes. That she recognized the possibility showed remarkable presence of mind. "We have plans for that," Sarah assured her. "Your special songs on your headphones, Dr. Abernathy nearby, and a quiet room we can go to if things get overwhelming." Emily nodded, then asked with heartbreaking practicality, "What if I forget who George is? That would make him sad." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, taking her daughter's thin hand. "George understands your condition better than most people, sweetheart. He won't be sad. He'll just remind you who he is, just like I do." Emily considered this, then reached for the drawer containing her drawing. "I need to bring this. Even if I forget why I have it, promise you'll help me give it to him." "I promise," Sarah said softly. The evening unfolded better than anyone dared hope. Emily remained alert and oriented throughout the car ride to the Ryman, gazing out the window with genuine interest as they passed Nashville landmarks. When they arrived at the historic venue's private entrance, she recognized it immediately. "Daddy brought me here for a Christmas show once," she recalled, a memory Sarah had forgotten herself. The seats were red velvet. The venue's staff treated Emily like visiting royalty, presenting her with a specially designed backstage pass and a miniature cowboy hat adorned with silver conchos. To Sarah's relief, Emily handled the attention gracefully, thanking each person with the good manners that had been instilled in her before her illness. From their private box, they had a perfect view of the stage while remaining somewhat separated from the main audience. The benefit concert was supporting neurological research, a cause George had become increasingly involved with since meeting Emily, and the sold-out crowd buzzed with anticipation. When the lights dimmed and George Strait walked on stage with his acoustic guitar, the audience erupted in applause. He wore his signature attire, crisp Western shirt, jeans, and cowboy hat, but his first words were disarmingly informal. "Evening, folks. Thanks for coming out tonight to support brain health research. It's a cause that's become mighty important to me lately. thanks to a special young lady who's taught me more about courage than I learned in all my 72 years." His gaze lifted to Emily's box, and he tipped his hat in a subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement. Emily beamed and waved back enthusiastically. "I'm going to start tonight with a song that's taken on new meaning for me this year," George continued, settling onto a stool as his band provided soft accompaniment. "It's about journeys, challenges, and keeping your heart pointed toward morning, no matter how long the night." The opening notes of Amarillo by Morning filled the hallowed venue, George's voice carrying the familiar melody with a particular emotional resonance that had the audience spellbound from the first verse. In their box, Emily closed her eyes, her body gently swaying to the music. When she opened them, she looked at Sarah with perfect clarity. "His voice sounds different live, doesn't it? Warmer somehow." Sarah nodded, too moved to speak. These moments of her daughter's complete presence, not just cognition, but insight, had become increasingly precious as they grew rarer. George performed for nearly an hour before addressing the audience again. "Folks, I'm going to take a short break, but when I come back, I'd like to try something a little different." He looked up toward Emily's box again. "With the permission of a very brave family, I'd like to share a story about why we're all really here tonight." Sarah had been prepared for this moment. George's team had discussed it with her in advance, ensuring she was comfortable with him acknowledging Emily's situation publicly. Still, she found herself holding her breath as he left the stage. 10 minutes later, there was a gentle knock at their box door. A venue manager stood outside with George himself. "Is this a good moment?" George asked softly, his eyes quickly assessing Emily's condition. Emily, who had been starting to drift into mild confusion during the break, immediately straightened at the sound of his voice. "George!" she exclaimed with genuine recognition. "I drew you a picture." Relief flooded his face as he entered and crouched beside her seat. "You did? Well, I'd surely love to see it." With trembling hands, Emily presented her carefully preserved drawing. George studied it with genuine appreciation, taking in the details and the message she'd written. "This is just about the finest gift I've ever received," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "May I share it with the audience when I tell them about our friendship?" Emily nodded solemnly. "It might help other kids who get lost in their heads." George blinked rapidly, then gently tipped her miniature cowboy hat. "Miss Emily Sullivan, you have a wisdom that puts the rest of us to shame." When George returned to the stage, he brought Emily's drawing, carefully displaying it on an easel beside his microphone stand. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to tell you about my friend Emily," he began, his amplified voice gentle but clear. "She's 9 years old, loves medical books, plays piano better than I ever could, and happens to be fighting one of the toughest battles I've ever witnessed." For the next few minutes, George shared Emily's story, not with pity, but with profound respect. He explained her condition in straightforward terms, described how his music had unexpectedly become a tool in her treatment, and spoke of the research being funded by tonight's benefit. "Emily's doctors have a theory," he continued. "They believe music creates pathways in our brains that can survive when other routes get blocked or damaged. The songs we hear in our earliest years, even before birth, leave traces so deep that almost nothing can erase them completely." He gestured to Emily's drawing on the easel. "Emily gave me this tonight. She drew it during what her doctors call a window of clarity, a time when her memories and abilities return briefly like sunshine breaking through storm clouds." The audience was utterly silent, every person in the historic venue hanging on his words. "The note she wrote says, 'Thank you for finding me when I was lost.' But the truth is," George's voice faltered slightly, "she's found something in all of us, a reminder of music's power, not just to entertain, but to heal and connect in ways science is only beginning to understand." He adjusted his guitar strap. With Emily's permission, I'd like to play a song I wrote for her. It's called Memory Bubbles, inspired by her own description of how memories feel when they're slipping away, like trying to catch bubbles underwater. The song that followed brought the audience to tears, a gentle, poignant melody that captured both the heartbreak of watching someone fade away and the determination to keep reaching for them through the fog. The chorus spoke of memories like stars that never truly vanish, just sometimes hide behind clouds. In their private box, Emily listened with complete attention, occasionally whispering to Sarah, "That's about me." When George sang the final notes, she applauded with genuine joy, standing to offer her appreciation. The moment was perfect until it wasn't. As the applause faded, Emily suddenly froze, her expression transforming from joy to blank confusion. Her hands stopped mid-clap, and she turned to Sarah with vacant eyes. "Who is that man?" she asked, pointing to George on stage. "Why are we here?" The dreaded dissociative episode had arrived, at precisely the worst moment, with George visibly waiting for Emily's reaction to his tribute song and 5,000 audience members watching. Sarah quickly slipped Emily's headphones over her ears, starting the emergency playlist they'd prepared, George's custom recording of Amarillo by Morning. But unlike previous episodes, the music didn't trigger immediate recognition. Emily's confusion deepened, her breathing becoming rapid as she looked around the unfamiliar venue with growing panic. "I want to go home," she whimpered. "Where are we? Who are all these people?" On stage, George could clearly see something was wrong. Without missing a beat, he smoothly transitioned to his next song while signaling discreetly to his manager off stage. Within moments, the venue manager appeared at their box, accompanied by Dr. Abernathy. "Dissociative episode," Sarah explained. Quickly. "The music isn't bringing her back like usual." Dr. Abernathy conducted a rapid assessment, his expression growing concerned. "Her heart rate's elevated, and she's showing signs of extreme anxiety. I think we need to get her back to familiar surroundings." As they prepared to leave, Emily became increasingly agitated, pulling off the headphones and crying out in distress. On stage, George continued performing, professionally maintaining the show while shooting concerned glances toward their box. They managed to get Emily to the private exit and into the waiting SUV, but her condition continued deteriorating. By the time they reached the hospital, she was experiencing her most severe cognitive event yet, unable to recognize Sarah, Dr. Abernathy, or any aspect of her surroundings. "What's happening?" Sarah demanded as nurses rushed Emily back to her room. "She was fine just an hour ago." Dr. Abernathy's face was grim. Sometimes emotional and sensory overstimulation can trigger accelerated episodes. The excitement, the new environment, the emotional impact of the song, it might have been too much at once. "But the music always helps," Sarah insisted desperately. "Why didn't it work this time?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Let's get her stabilized and run some new scans." The next several hours were a nightmare. Emily remained in a profoundly dissociated state, not responding to any of their usual interventions. Even the George Strait recordings that had reliably reached her before seemed ineffective now. MRI scans revealed concerning new patterns of activity, or rather lack of activity, in key regions of her brain. Around 2 in the morning, as Sarah sat beside Emily's bed, a soft knock came at the door. To her astonishment, George Strait himself stood in the doorway, still in his concert clothes, but with the weariness of the evening evident on his face. "I came as soon as the show ended," he said quietly. "My wife's parking the car." "How is she?" Sarah shook her head, too exhausted and frightened for pretense. "Not good. Something's different this time. Even your recordings aren't reaching her." George nodded solemnly. taking in the sight of Emily lying unnaturally still, her eyes open, but vacant, monitoring equipment surrounding her bed. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to his guitar case. "Of course, but Dr. Abernathy says we shouldn't expect—" "I understand," George interrupted gently, "but I'd still like to try if that's all right with you." He pulled a chair close to Emily's, a bed, and removed his guitar. Instead of immediately playing, however, he simply sat beside her, speaking in a low, conversational tone. "Evening, Miss Emily. Seems you had a rough night. Thought I might sit with you a while, if that's okay." He adjusted his guitar strings unhurriedly. "You know, when I was about your age, I got thrown from a horse and hit my head something fierce. Couldn't remember my own dog's name for nearly 2 days. Scared my mama half to death." There was no response from Emily, but George continued as if they were having a normal conversation. "That drawing you gave me tonight, that's some real talent. Got me thinking about when I first tried to learn drawing. Made a mess of it. Horses looking like strange dogs, people with arms coming out of their heads." He chuckled softly. "Figured I better stick to music." Sarah watched in fascination. Rather than immediately launching into music as a medical intervention, George was simply being present, talking to Emily as a person, not a patient. After several minutes of gentle conversation, George finally strummed a soft chord. "Remember this one, Emily? It's not one of my big hits, just a little song from my 3rd album. Your daddy must have played it for you, though, because you sang along when I played it in your hospital room last month." He began playing You. "Look so good in love," his voice barely above a whisper, as if sharing a lullaby rather than performing. By the 2nd verse, a subtle change came over Emily. Not the dramatic awakening they'd seen before, but something quieter. Her breathing. The video clip played on the large screen in the conference room at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Emily Sullivan, sitting cross-legged on her hospital bed, singing "I Cross My Heart" with remarkable clarity, while George Strait played guitar beside her. The neuroimaging displayed in a smaller window showed her brain activity during the session, areas lighting up that had been dormant in scans taken just hours earlier. Dr. Abernathy paused the recording and turned to face the assembled team of specialists. "What you're seeing is unprecedented in cases of juvenile neurodegeneration with memory predominance." Emily's cognitive function scores during and immediately following Mr. Strait's visit showed a 47% improvement across all domains. The conference room buzzed with murmured discussions. Gathered around the table were neurologists, music therapists, developmental psychologists, and researchers from 4 major universities, all drawn by the remarkable case that was challenging established understandings of memory degradation. The effect was temporary, cautioned Dr. Lisa Chen, a neurologist from Johns Hopkins who had flown in specifically for this consultation. "According to your follow-up assessments, Emily returned to baseline within 36 hours. "Yes," Dr. Abernathy acknowledged, "but that's significantly longer than the typical duration of her lucidity periods with recorded music, which rarely exceed 2 hours. And look at the depth of memory access." He forwarded the video to Emily, recounting details of her father's sapphire ring proposal. This was a memory from 3 years ago that she hasn't referenced since her diagnosis. The neural pathways shouldn't have been accessible at all, according to our understanding of her condition. "What about the custom recordings Mr. Strait provided?" asked Dr. Marcus Winters, the music therapy specialist. "Have they produced similar effects?" Sarah Sullivan, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, spoke up. "Not as powerful as the live interaction, but definitely stronger than standard recordings. Emily responds especially well to the personalized introductions, where George speaks directly to her before each song." The discussion continued for hours, with experts debating mechanisms, proposing theories, and designing research protocols. Sarah watched with mixed emotions, Hope that Emily's case might advance understanding of these devastating neurological conditions, but also the ache of knowing that despite all this brilliant analysis, her daughter's prognosis remained grim. When the meeting finally concluded, Dr. Abernathy walked Sarah to the cafeteria for a much-needed coffee break. "I know that was overwhelming," he said gently, "but I wanted you there. These are the best minds in the field, and they're all invested in Emily now." Sarah nodded, stirring her coffee absently. They kept talking about the Strait protocol, like it's something that can be standardized. But how do you standardize a legendary musician making a personal connection with my daughter? It's not replicable. Perhaps not exactly, Dr. Abernathy conceded, but understanding the mechanisms could help us develop targeted therapies for other children. The emotional resonance, the pre-birth neural pathways formed during your pregnancy, the multi-sensory experience of live music, these are all elements we can study. And in the meantime, Sarah asked the question that had been weighing on her since the visit. Emily keeps asking when George is coming back. The recordings help, but Dr. Abernathy sighed. Sarah, George Strait did something incredibly generous, but he's 72 years old with limited touring commitments now. We can't expect— I'm not expecting anything, Sarah interrupted. I'm just trying to give my daughter whatever good days we have left. The doctor nodded sympathetically. I understand, and we'll continue refining the music therapy approach. Dr. Winters has some interesting ideas about incorporating live musicians who perform straight songs in similar vocal ranges. But as they both knew, it wouldn't be the same. 2 weeks later, George Strait sat in his manager's office in Nashville, reviewing the schedule for his limited upcoming tour. 6 arena dates spread across 3 months, designed to accommodate his desire for more time at home without disappointing his still devoted fan base. About the meet and greet packages, his manager Tom was saying. We've sold out the premium tier at all venues, 200 VIP backstage passes at each show. George nodded, though such details had never been his favorite part of the business. After more than 40 years in music, he'd earned the right to focus on the creative aspects and leave the commercial machinery to others. There's something else, Tom continued, sliding a folder across the desk. Since your visit with Emily Sullivan went public, we've received hundreds of requests from families with sick children. Everyone wants the George Strait miracle. George frowned. It wasn't a miracle, Tom. It was just music doing what music does. Whatever you call it, it's created quite a situation. Children's hospitals in every city on the tour route have reached out. We can't possibly accommodate everyone, and choosing a few feels arbitrary. George leaned back in his chair, thinking of Emily's face when she recognized Amarillo by Morning, that moment of pure connection that had nothing to do with his celebrity and everything to do with the mysterious power of melody and memory. What about the research team at Vanderbilt? He asked. Any updates? Tom nodded. They've established a formal study, 15 children with various memory-affecting conditions, using your recorded songs as part of structured therapy sessions. Preliminary results show modest improvements, but nothing as dramatic as with Emily. George wasn't surprised. Something about Emily's specific situation, the prenatal exposure to his music, the emotional connection through her late father, had created a unique neural landscape that his songs could navigate. I'd like to see her again, he said suddenly. Tom looked up, startled. Emily! I'm sure that could be arranged, but not just a quick visit. I want to understand better what happened, how the music reaches her. Maybe if I spend more time, work with the doctors. His manager's expression shifted to concern. George, I know that visit affected you deeply, but you're in the middle of finalizing a new album. You've got the tour coming up, and Norma mentioned you promised to help with the new foaling season at the ranch, taking on a complex medical case. I'm not taking on a case, George interrupted, uncharacteristically sharp. I'm following my gut about something important. The room fell silent. Throughout his long career, George Strait had built a reputation on authenticity and artistic integrity. When he felt strongly about something, a song, a producer, a creative direction, those who knew him had learned to listen. "Okay," Tom said finally. "What do you have in mind?" Sarah was folding laundry in Emily's hospital room when her phone rang with an unfamiliar Nashville number. Emily was having one of her cloudy days, staring vacantly at the ceiling while one of George's custom recordings played softly in the background. "Hello? Sarah, this is George Strait." She nearly dropped the phone. "Mr. Strait, I thank you again for the recordings. They've been wonderful for Emily." "Please call me George," he said warmly. "How is she doing?" Sarah glanced at her daughter, weighing honesty against politeness. "Up and down. The neurodegeneration is continuing, but she still has windows of clarity, especially with your music." "That's actually why I'm calling," George said. "I've been thinking a lot about Emily since our visit. I've spoken with Dr. Abernathy about the research they're doing, and, well, I'd like to be more involved." "Involved?" Sarah repeated, unsure what he meant. "I'm coming back to Nashville next week to finish some recording sessions," he explained. "I've arranged to extend my stay. With your permission, I'd like to work with Emily and her doctors more formally, try different songs, approaches, maybe even write something specifically for her condition." Sarah sank into the chair beside Emily's bed, overwhelmed. "That's incredibly generous, but your schedule, I can't ask you to—" "You didn't ask," George interrupted gently. "This feels important, Sarah. In 40 years of making music, I've never encountered anything like what happened in that hospital room. If my songs can help Emily, maybe they can help understand these conditions better. Maybe they can help other children." His sincerity was unmistakable, and Sarah found herself blinking back tears. "Emily will be thrilled," she managed. "We both will." Plans were quickly arranged. George would visit the hospital 3 afternoons the following week, working with Emily and a small team of researchers from Dr. Abernathy's group. The sessions would be documented, but kept private. No media, no publicity. When Sarah told Emily during one of her clear periods, the child's reaction surprised her. "Will he help me remember Daddy better?" Emily asked, her fingers tracing the silver hat pin she now kept on her bedside table. "Is that what you want to remember most?" Sarah asked softly. Emily nodded solemnly. "Sometimes I can see Daddy's face, but I can't hear his voice anymore unless the music is playing. Then it comes back." George Strait arrived at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, wearing jeans, boots, and a simple button-down shirt, deliberately dressed down to avoid attention. He carried 2 guitar cases and a notebook filled with ideas he'd developed after extensive conversations with Dr. Abernathy and a music cognition specialist. This visit was different from the first. While their initial meeting had been spontaneous and emotionally driven, this was a purposeful exploration. The hospital had provided a larger room with subtle monitoring equipment installed and a small observation area where researchers could document Emily's responses without intruding on the interaction. Emily was having a difficult morning. When George entered, she regarded him with polite confusion rather than recognition. "Hello, Emily," he said warmly, setting down his guitar cases. "I'm George. We met a few weeks ago." She studied him with furrowed brow, then looked to Sarah for confirmation. "The cowboy singer," Sarah prompted. "Remember his hat pin?" Emily's hand moved instinctively to the silver pin attached to her hospital gown, fingers tracing its outline. "The bubbles," she murmured. "You help the bubbles stay still." George glanced questioningly at Sarah, who explained Emily's metaphor for her fragmented memories. "That's right," he said, sitting down beside her bed. "I brought my guitar again. Would you like to hear a song?" Emily nodded cautiously. George selected his older, more worn acoustic guitar, the one he'd used during their first meeting, and began to play Amarillo by Morning just as before. The effect wasn't as immediate this time. Emily listened politely, but showed no dramatic shift in awareness. George continued playing, moving through The Chair and I Cross My Heart with similar results. Emily remained present but disconnected, not experiencing the profound awakening they'd witnessed previously. In the observation room, researchers exchanged concerned glances. Dr. Abernathy made notes, his expression troubled. George, however, seemed unperturbed. During a brief break, while Emily had a snack, he conferred with Sarah in hushed tones. "She's fighting harder today," he observed. "The fog is thicker," Sarah nodded, impressed by his insight. "The disease progresses in waves. This week has been particularly difficult." "May I try something different?" George asked. "I've been researching musical memory formation, talking to some folks who study this. The emotional connection seems to be key, not just familiar melodies, but the associations they trigger." "Anything is worth trying," Sarah said. George returned to Emily's bedside with his second guitar, a vintage Martin that he normally reserved for songwriting sessions at his ranch. "Emily," he said gently, "your mom tells me you're having a harder time finding your memories today. That must be frustrating." Emily looked at him directly, a flicker of genuine emotion crossing her face. "The bubbles move too fast," she said simply. "I understand," George replied, though of course he couldn't truly comprehend the experience of her deteriorating mind. "I brought a different guitar today. This one has a special sound that might help reach deeper memories." He began to tune the instrument, his movements unhurried. "Your dad was a doctor who helped children, right?" Emily nodded. "And he loved my music." Another nod, slightly more engaged. "What was your favorite thing to do with your dad, Emily?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Emily's gaze drifted to the window, and Sarah thought she'd lost her again, but then quietly, "Dancing. He let me stand on his boots." George nodded, as if this confirmed something important. Rather than playing one of his familiar hits, he began a gentle rolling guitar pattern, the introduction to a song Sarah didn't recognize. "I wrote this yesterday," George explained, his voice soft. "It's called Standing on Daddy's Boots." The simple melody filled the room, and George began to sing, a story about a father teaching his little girl to dance by letting her stand on his cowboy boots, spinning her around their backyard while her mother watched from the kitchen window. The details matched Michael and Emily's ritual so specifically that Sarah realized George must have asked for these memories during his preparations. As the chorus began, something remarkable happened. Emily's posture changed, her spine straightening, her eyes focusing intently on George. By the second verse, about the father explaining that someday she'd dance at her wedding, but he'd always remember these backyard moments, tears were streaming down Emily's face. "That's my daddy," she whispered. "That's my dance." In the observation room, monitors showed dramatic shifts in Emily's brain activity, areas lighting up that had been dormant during the earlier songs, despite their familiarity. George continued singing, his voice gentle but clear, the lyrics weaving specific details about Michael Sullivan that Sarah had shared, his red stethoscope, his habit of humming while he worked, the bedtime stories he invented about Dr. Moon, who healed star children when they caught cosmic colds. By the final chorus, Emily was fully present, more connected and aware than she'd been in weeks. Her eyes shone with recognition, not just of George, but of her own history. "He wrote me a song," she said wonderingly to Sarah, "a song about Daddy and me." "He did, sweetheart," Sarah confirmed through tears. The afternoon continued with remarkable progress. After the emotional breakthrough triggered by the personalized song, Emily became increasingly responsive to George's standard repertoire as well. She sang along, shared memories, and engaged in coherent conversation about both recent and distant events. Most significantly, she began asking questions that demonstrated awareness of her condition, something she rarely did during her periods of clarity. "Is my brain still getting worse?" she asked directly when George took a break to rest his voice. The adults exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. "Yes," Sarah finally said, believing her daughter deserved honesty. "The doctors are trying everything they can, but the disease is still there." Emily absorbed this with surprising composure. "But the music helps," she stated, rather than asked. "It seems to," George confirmed. "We don't fully understand why, but it's like the songs create paths through the foggy parts." Emily considered this. "Could you teach other people my songs for when you can't be here?" The question revealed both heartbreaking awareness of her situation and remarkable problem-solving clarity. In the observation room, Dr. Abernathy leaned forward, deeply moved by the child's insight. "That's actually a great idea," George said. "What if we recorded some sessions together? And I could teach some other musicians how to play these songs the way that seems to work best for you." The remainder of the afternoon was spent developing what the research team would later call the Emily Protocol, a carefully structured sequence of musical interventions, beginning with the personalized "standing on Daddy's boots" to establish emotional connection, followed by specific George Strait classics performed with particular attention to tempo, key, and vocal emphasis that seemed most effective at triggering Emily's memory access. When it was time for George to leave, Emily was still remarkably present, the longest period of clear cognition she'd experienced since her hospitalization began. "Will you come tomorrow?" she asked, showing no signs of the fatigue that typically followed her lucid episodes. George hesitated, looking to the doctors for guidance. "If Emily feels up to it, another session could be valuable," Dr. Abernathy said cautiously, "though we should be careful not to overexert her." "I'd like that very much," George agreed. "Same time tomorrow?" As he packed up his guitars, Dr. Abernathy pulled him aside. "What you did today, that personalized song approach, it's revolutionary. The custom activation of autobiographical memory through specific musical storytelling. We've never seen results like this." George shrugged modestly. "It's just songwriting, finding the story that needs telling and setting it to the right melody." "It's far more than that," the neurologist insisted. "You've given us an entirely new therapeutic avenue to explore." After George departed, the medical team gathered in Emily's room to conduct cognitive assessments. Her scores were dramatically improved across all domains: memory recall, executive function, language processing, and emotional regulation. "How long will this last?" Sarah asked Dr. Abernathy privately, while Emily chatted animatedly with one of the nurses about her favorite books, a conversation that would have been impossible that morning. "I don't know," he admitted. "But there's something extraordinary happening in Emily's neural pathways during these sessions. The personalized song triggered activity in regions of her brain that have been inactive for weeks." "But the disease is still there," Sarah pressed, needing to keep her hope tethered to reality. "This isn't curing her." "No," Dr. Abernathy confirmed gently. "The fundamental neurodegeneration continues, but what we're seeing suggests possibilities for maintenance therapy that might significantly improve quality of life and preserve cognitive function longer than we anticipated." Later that evening, after Emily had finally drifted to sleep, still remarkably lucid until the very end of the day, Sarah found a text message from George. "Something special happened today. I've been making music for 50 years, but I've never felt it matter quite like this. See you tomorrow. G." Sarah ran her fingers over the screen, overwhelmed with gratitude for this unexpected alliance between country music royalty and her little girl with the fading memories. For the first time since Emily's diagnosis, she allowed herself to feel something close to hope, not for a miracle cure, but for meaningful days ahead, where her daughter might remain present enough to create memories worth keeping, even if their permanence couldn't be guaranteed. Outside in the hallway, unbeknownst to Sarah, Dr. Abernathy was engaged in a heated phone conversation with the hospital's ethics committee chair. "I understand the concerns," he was saying, his voice low but intense, "but the results today were unprecedented. We can't simply—" He paused, listening to the objections from the other end of the line. "Yes, I'm aware of the publicity risks and the exceptional nature of the intervention, but this isn't about creating false hope or special treatment. What we're learning could change therapeutic approaches for thousands of children." Another pause. "No, I can't guarantee how long Mr. Strait will remain involved, but while he is, we have an extraordinary opportunity to document and understand these mechanisms." As Dr. Abernathy continued his advocacy, down the hall, Emily slept peacefully, the personalized song about dancing on her father's boots playing softly on repeat, a musical lifeline tethering her to memories that otherwise drifted beyond her reach, like bubbles underwater, briefly visible but impossible to grasp.